Is the biblical text simply a collection of ancient mythic legends copied from older mythologies that bear no root in historical reality? Whether you're a believer, skeptic, or simply curious, this video will reveal why the Bible is a myth, but why this fact cannot be used to dismiss its claims, and why these mythic elements make it more, not less, worthy of examination. So let's dive right in. Now, scholars are going to define mythical passages, particularly those found within the Old Testament, as those that display generic similarities to other ancient Near Eastern texts that are considered mythical. And so if we look, for instance, here at Genesis 1:2, where it states, "And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters," this actually describes the earth prior to God's creative activity as formless and void. This phrase, face of the waters, has been equated with Tiamat, who is a Babylonian goddess of chaos, whom the Babylonian god Marduk actually defeats in the Enuma Elish. And so already within the second verse of the biblical text, we are seeing mythology. Now, this is certainly not a complete definition of mythology when it comes to ancient literature, but by the end of this video, after going through several stories from the biblical text, we are going to see what that complete definition is. Now, some of the very common mythological stories that you will find referenced within the biblical text are going to be in the early chapters of Genesis, such as Genesis 1-3, that's the creation of the garden narrative. There's also Genesis 6, where it talks about the Nephilim. Then you also have Genesis 6-9, which talks about the flood. The Bible is filled with mythological stories, and we are simply going to scratch the surface at a couple of these today. Now, if you are curious about the flood myth and its comparison to other ancient Near Eastern flood myths, you can go check out that video. But I want to start with some mythological stories that actually involve individuals. And you'll see a handful of those individuals here. We've got Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, David, and Esther. I do want to point out there's an incredible resource called the Lexham Glossary of Literary Types. And this is something that you can get in Logos Bible software. It defines all of the literary types used within the biblical text, and I lost count at about 170. And what you'll find is you'll have numerous types of literature working together within the same overall narrative or structure of a story. Now, to briefly cover each one of these characters, when we look at the call of Abraham that you can find in Genesis 12, 1-9, this actually serves as the link between the two sections of the Genesis scroll. And that first section is Genesis 1-11, that's the primeval history, and then Genesis 12-50 deals with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph and their stories. And essentially what you have here is you have Abraham being called out by God. He's called away from his father's house so that God can make him into a great nation and bless him so that Abraham can in turn be a blessing. And ultimately, Israel, the people and nation, will be established through Abraham's offspring within the biblical text. You'll see that through Jacob, his 12 sons. Jacob is renamed Israel later within Genesis twice. And fast forwarding a little bit, we have the Joseph story. Now, Joseph is a son of Israel, son of Jacob, and he's sold into slavery. And he ultimately becomes the second in command of Egypt after going through slavery and imprisonment. However, because he rose to second in command, what ends up happening when there's a famine in the land, his brothers who sold him into slavery come to Egypt seeking food. And they meet Joseph, although they don't know it's him. And there's a very long episode where Joseph is angry with them. He sends them away. But ultimately, Joseph breaks down to his brothers, reveals his true identity as their brother, and they become reunited as a family. But this is what Joseph says in Genesis 45, verse 5. He says, "God sent me before you to preserve life." And so we see God working within this story just as he did within the Abraham story. And off to the right-hand side, you can see the different literary types within his story. Now, if we fast forward to the Moses story, this is actually at a point in time where Joseph has long been gone. The Pharaoh in Egypt at this time has forgotten who Joseph is, and Moses is actually rescued. He grows up in royalty within Egypt, and ultimately he flees Egypt for Midian because he murdered an Egyptian. He meets a priest in Midian. That priest becomes his father-in-law, and one day while Moses is out shepherding his father-in-law's flock, the Lord meets him at the burning bush. And if you read the context for this, the Lord is actually on his way. It states, I believe in Exodus 3, verse 8, right around there somewhere, that God is actually coming down to his people. So he's coming off the mountain of God to go to Egypt to his people. And this is what he tells Moses in Exodus 3:10. He says, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." And what's interesting to note about this is some translations will have the word come, some will have the word go. And I will stand by come being the best definition for this. And the reason is because what you see in Exodus 12:12 right here, if I tell you to go somewhere, that implies that you're going alone. If I say come, that means that we are going together. And when you read Exodus 12:12 here, it's the Lord talking during the Passover narrative before the final plague. And the Lord says, "And on all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment." So this, along with the narrative that God is already on his way down the mountain to meet his people, he's heard their cry. He is inviting Moses to come with him and to be the vessel that he uses to rescue his people. This is a classic hero's journey if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell. It's a call back to the land he once lived in royalty to free the people who had been oppressed as slaves in that nation. And now Moses' successor is a man named Joshua. And we see something very similar to the Moses story. In the first chapter of Joshua, when Joshua takes over after Moses has died, the Lord says to him, "Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you." Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. So there's the same thing, that Joshua is going to be the vessel that God uses, but God is going to be the driving action behind this inheritance of the land. And then one of my favorites is Esther, a woman that within the biblical text saves the Jewish people from being annihilated. And the overall message of the book of Esther is an uplifting one. It's this idea that things may be bad, but God has a way of righting all wrongs, and that everything will work out in the end for God's people. And what's really unique about the book of Esther is that God is not mentioned once in the entire Esther scroll. You can do a word search for God, it's not going to come up. But there's still the idea and the theme that God is working essentially behind the scenes through Esther and Mordecai to save the Jewish people. There's also King David. And while King David does have a mixed history of very good things that he does and also very bad things that he does, we actually see that within 1 Samuel chapter 7, that God establishes the Davidic covenant for the eternal rule of David's line. And you can find that specifically in 1 Samuel 7:23 and 24a, where you have David saying, "And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth whom God went to redeem to be his people," and even makes reference to the redemption from Egypt and Egypt's gods. And then in verse 24, it says, "And you established for yourself your people Israel to be your people forever." So again, David's being used as a vessel. Now at this point, you may be wondering how any of these stories are mythic. We've even seen in the Joseph story where it wasn't labeled as a literary type as mythic. However, all of these stories have an overarching mythic theme to them. But before that's revealed, we need to look at a different style of mythology within the biblical text, and this is going to appear much more like true mythology, and that is polemic literature. We see plenty of times in the biblical text where there are direct polemics or aggressive attacks on neighboring and rivaling religions. We see this very clearly in Psalm 74, where it's giving a description of God. And it says, "You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness." Now, while scholars are divided on the exact historical context, many will lean towards the Babylonian invasion and destruction of the temple in 586 or 587 BCE. They seem largely to agree that the situation that caused the psalmist to compose this lament was some kind of destruction or defilement of the temple. And I'm actually going to link 2 articles below that discuss whether or not this psalm has a creative motif behind it. The consensus view is that it does. They are both very good articles, and I'd highly recommend reading if this type of polemic within the biblical text is of interest to you. Now, what scholars are going to link this specific passage to is the Babylonian goddess Tiamat, who is defeated by the god Marduk that we talked about earlier. But what Marduk ends up doing after Tiamat is defeated is he takes her body, he divides it or splits it in half, and from each half, he makes the earth and the sky or the heavens. Now, Psalm 74 is not the only instance within the biblical text that we see a polemic against the Marduk and Tiamat battle. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, when God creates the expanse in the midst of the waters, verse 7 states that God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And then in verse 8, God calls the expanse heaven. And because of this similarity in languages between the two accounts, scholars have linked this to the Marduk and Tiamat battle. There's also Psalm 89 that again is describing God, but it says this, it says, "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahav like a carcass." And so there's at least one polemic element within this, arguably 2, and I would lean towards that there are 2, but you'll see the word sea in blue. And the Hebrew word for sea is Yam. And Yam is also the name of a Canaanite deity of the sea, and is also associated with chaos. So there are scholars that are going to link this idea of God ruling the raging of the sea to this actually being a polemic against Yam. When the waves rise, Yahweh stills them. So it's Yahweh, not Yam, who is in control of the seas. And then you crushed Rahav like a carcass. This Hebrew word Rahav occurs 6 times within the Old Testament. And this does appear to be the name for one of the chaotic sea monsters that you'll see predominantly in ancient Near Eastern religion, although there is some discussion around whether or not Rahab is unique to Hebrew. But as I said, Rahav occurs 6 times within the biblical text, and the biblical references to Rahav are all poetic. You can see here in Isaiah 51:9 that it actually talks about Yahweh cutting Rahav in pieces and piercing the dragon. So again, this does appear to be a reference to the defeat of some primeval chaotic monster. However, you'll have other instances within the biblical text, such as Psalm 87 verse 4 and Isaiah 30 verse 7, where Rahab actually symbolizes Egypt. And so this is yet another way to describe via mythology that Yahweh is superior. The biblical text is not actually stating that Yahweh had some kind of battle with a chaotic sea monster. You won't find that anywhere within the biblical text. But what the biblical authors are doing is competing against rivaling religions of their day, and they are using the terminology, they are using themes of those particular religious texts to assert that it is actually Yahweh who is in control. These are not meant to be taken literally, that Yahweh somehow actually battled sea monsters or pierced dragons. And on that note too, these battles with chaotic sea monsters, we also see where the biblical authors use epithets that belong to other deities to describe Yahweh. We see that in the terminology, the rider on the clouds. This is an epithet that was originally referred to Baal or Baal, who is the bringer of rain and agricultural fertility within the Canaanite religion. This is applied to Yahweh throughout the Old Testament, such as in Deuteronomy, there's Psalms, there's also Isaiah 19. And actually, this is applied to Jesus within the New Testament. Specifically in Matthew chapter 26, you have Jesus talking to the high priest when he is on trial. And he says this when he's being questioned about being the Son of Man. He says, "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." So we see this bleed over into the New Testament as well. Then there's also the term Most High. This occurs in the Ugaritic literature to describe Baal or Baal as well. You can find that in the Kirta Tablet 3, column 3. However, this is used throughout the biblical text to describe Yahweh as well. You see that in at least 6 different places within the Psalms. You've got Deuteronomy, you've got Daniel, as well as 2 Samuel. And there's actually a fantastic article by the late and great Old Testament scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser, on this very issue of the Most High. There's a back and forth between him and another guy. And to put it politely, Dr. Heiser simply eats this guy's lunch on the issue, but I'll link that below too. But I bring these epithets up because these are often used to make the claim that the biblical text simply stole from the neighboring religions around them, since the biblical text was written at a later point in time, as if the biblical authors had no original thoughts whatsoever. And all they were capable of doing was simply stealing characteristics and traits of rivaling deities and applying them to their deity. However, I'll make a humorous point here, but we do the exact same thing today. We can look at the term GOAT, the greatest of all time. We see this a lot within sports. And you've got a GOAT in every single sport. And there's debate within every single sport about who the GOAT is based on the fans of the specific person. Now you can see here, we've got Michael Jordan, who's been called the greatest of all time for a very long time. But you've also got the crowd that will say that no, LeBron is actually the GOAT. And this might actually be one of the things that we can actually definitively settle here within this conversation today. The GOAT in this case is absolutely Michael Jordan. There's no debate or discussion on that whatsoever. But the point I want to make here is that, does this mean that LeBron James is a completely fabricated person that was created by the Lakers or really the Cavs back in the day, and by their fan base to discredit the legacy of Michael Jordan? No, that's absolutely absurd. LeBron James is a real person. He's a great basketball player. I would just argue he's not as good as Michael Jordan. And I know the response to this is going to be, yeah, but we have video evidence of LeBron James. He can prove himself today, all of these different things. I completely understand that. Take this with a grain of salt and some humor. The point I'm trying to make here is that we have modern mythology within our culture. And now shifting back to the biblical text, while we've talked about individuals, polemics, epithets, there's also entire books that seem to be mythic in nature, such as Jonah. The book of Jonah is designed as a microcosm of the entire Old Testament. Chapter 1 is essentially a miniature version of it all. And then Jonah contains numerous literary styles, themes, images, design patterns, and plot lines that have been present from the very beginning of the text. And what's interesting to note about Jonah is that Jonah is actually not a standalone story, as we often might think of it. There is an expectation that the author of Jonah has placed on you as the reader, that you already know who Jonah is, that he is a real person from the past. He's a prophet from the past, because we can find reference to Jonah in 2 Kings 14:25, where it talks about Jonah, the son of Amittai. And then who do we meet in Jonah 1:1? We see, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. And the reason I say this is a continuous narrative is because some English translations don't have this. They just begin with the word of the Lord came to Jonah. But what you actually have in the Hebrew text of Jonah is the letter vav prefixed to the first word, which is the verb haya. And that vav is often translated as and, but it can mean now as well. And so what this actually indicates, when it says now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, this is an indication to you as the reader that this is a continuation of a story rather than the start of a new one or a standalone story. And Jonah is a very mythic story. There are a lot of strange things that happen in Jonah. And typically the arguments, unfortunately, center around things that at the end of the day don't matter at all. There's a clip from Richard Dawkins who talked about how someone came up to him and said, well, wait, the Hebrew word that we translate as whale is actually the word for fish. And Dawkins just completely laughed it off and essentially just made a joke out of it, saying, oh, that just changes everything then. But I say that to illustrate the point that the conversation typically revolves around silly topics like that, or topics such as, could a person actually, from a scientific standpoint, live inside of a large fish or a whale for 3 days and 3 nights? And we do this at the expense of what the text is actually trying to tell us. Now, in regard to this large fish, there's actually something that's very interesting within the text. And there are many indications within Jonah, but this is certainly one of them, that Jonah uses hyperbolic language and storytelling to communicate a message. What scholars have noted about the fish is that the Hebrew term for fish, which is the word dog, changes from the masculine in verse 17 of chapter 1 to the feminine form in fish, ha-daga, in verse 1 of chapter 2. And so what scholars have noted on this is that although the ship remains problematic, Jonah's presence in the belly of the fish suggests the imagery of pregnancy for the fish and new birth or new creation for Jonah. Because if you look at chapter 2, it's Jonah reciting a poem inside the belly of a fish, And a lot of people have linked that to him actually descending to the depths, only to be spat back up and rebirthed to go accomplish the calling that God has set before him in Nineveh. And prior to this fish narrative in Jonah, what we see is when Jonah is actually fleeing the call of the Lord tells him to go to Nineveh, which is in the east. Jonah gets on a ship in the town of Joppa and flees to Tarshish, which is as far west in the known world at that time. And because of this, the Lord hurls a great wind on the sea. And during the storm, Jonah was in the inner part of the ship and was fast asleep. Again, some people have linked this fast asleep terminology to death, linking this linguistic similarity for the sake of storytelling. And then ultimately the sailors cast lots. Jonah fesses up that it's his fault. He says he's fleeing from the Lord's presence. The sailors actually attempt to make it to shore. They fail. And then ultimately they cast Jonah into the sea, but they're hesitant. And then when they do this, the storm calms. And the sailors fear the Lord because of this, and they offer sacrifices to Yahweh and make vows. And then you get the Lord appointing the great sea creature or the fish to come and swallow Jonah. And so we can see this is very mythic in nature. However, this is a theme that is picked up on in Matthew's gospel when Jesus finds himself in a very similar situation. Matthew 8:23-27 states that Jesus got into a boat. His disciples were with him. They followed him there. And then there arose a great storm on the sea so that the boat was being swamped, very similar to that Jonah story. But Jesus, just like Jonah, was asleep. And the disciples go to Jesus, just like the sailors went to Jonah, and tell Jesus, "Save us, Lord, for we are perishing." And then this is one of the most well-known lines within Christianity is, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" And after this, it states, "Then he, Jesus, rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" And their response makes complete sense when you consider what we've looked at within the Jonah narrative and Psalm 89, because they are witnessing Jesus doing things that only Yahweh was capable of doing. That is calming the raging of the sea. And then what do they make when they see Jesus actually fulfilling where Jonah failed? And there's a lot more to the links between Jesus and Jonah that we'll do in another video. But the point here is that these stories are intentionally designed to communicate a very specific message. And the ancient reader would have understood exactly what this message was. While it might seem convenient that these actions are linked specifically to Jesus, it's actually not something that is unique to Jesus. We see this in the book of Acts, picking up with that Jonah theme. In Acts chapter 9, records Peter performing a miracle, raising someone from the dead in Joppa, that same town that Jonah fled from. And this miracle became known throughout, and many in Joppa believed. And Peter remains in Joppa for many days with Simon, a tanner. And there's a unique story to that as well. I'll post an article about that below. And then Joppa is where Peter has his famous vision in Acts chapter 10 with the sheet coming down 3 times with all types of unclean animals. God tells Peter, "Get up, kill and eat." He says, "I've never let anything unclean touch my lips." And you find out in the next chapter that Peter realizes that it was a reference to the 3 Gentiles that came seeking him out, that he was to call no person unclean. And so you see where Joppa was the place of fleeing for Jonah. For Peter, someone who had had his own faults, such as denying Jesus 3 times, Peter ends up bringing God's message to the very town that Jonah fled from God's calling. And this is actually in line with the central theme of the book of Acts. And this is outlined very well in the book titled Grasping God's Word. The authors Duval and Hayes point out something very interesting in this. They say that while Peter is the leading figure in the mission to the Jews in Acts 1-12, the attention shifts to Paul in Acts 13-28. As the gospel moves to the ends of the earth. But actually, the leading figure in all of Acts is the Spirit of God, who works in both Peter and Paul in similar ways. And this is the link to every single story or polemic or epithet that we have looked at so far, leading up to this point, that God or the Spirit of God is the leading factor behind all of these individuals and accounts. And this is where we can complete the definition of mythology. Because while there is disagreement on the micro definition of mythology, there is agreement within scholarship on the broad definition of mythology, and that is that mythology is any story about the activity of the gods. And this is the reason that since nearly the entire Bible depicts the actions of God, that cannot be the sole criteria for defining myth in the Bible. And that is why we stated earlier that mythical passages, particularly those in the Old Testament, are commonly defined as those that are sharing a similarity to another ancient Near Eastern mythic story. We looked at Genesis 1 verse 2 earlier, but actually within Genesis 1:1, you meet the main character of the entire biblical text. It's the third word in the Hebrew Bible, but it's God. You have, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Or if you want the translation that's likely more in line with the Hebrew syntax, "When God began to create the land and the skies." Either way, you meet God in the very first verse of the Bible. He's the only character in chapter 1 that does any type of speaking. And it's not until the latter half of chapter 2 that the man that God uniquely created and placed in the garden speaks. So what does the broad definition of mythology mean for the current discussion? Well, it means that you cannot state that the biblical text is a myth, then impose an improper definition of myth to falsify the details of the text. Because in our culture, myth is equated with fairy tales, with stories that are not actually true. And so when we impose that definition of myth back onto the Bible, whether it's unintentionally or not intentionally, it is both dishonest and misleading. Because what you're doing is you're properly defining something and then using the proper definition against itself. It's oxymoronic. And so the proper response to someone dismissing the Bible by claiming that the Bible is a myth should not be an immediate defense to the topic at hand that the other person wants to bring up. The correct response should simply be yes, and? In other words, you're letting the person know that they have properly defined what the Bible is. And then the discussions that take place every single day and are worthy to have and are healthy and should be had about the historical accuracy and reliability of the biblical text can continue. All right, everyone, now it's your turn to join the discussion. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to check out this video that YouTube thinks you'll like, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks so much.